Okay, so this is the second video lecture on the topic of socialization. The last one, I just introduced what the concept was. In this video lecture, I want to introduce some of the different theories. So one way to think about what it means to be socialized is it is about this internalization of society. Often we call that the self, the way we think about our place in the world, our relationship to the world. That is what we mean by the self. So we have a whole bunch of different theories, right? Some of these you probably are familiar with, especially if you've taken psychology or even human growth and development. So I want to break them down on this slide. So some of the classical theories, of course, you might be familiar with Freud, right? Freud's theory of the way the self develops. He argued that you had these three elements of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. Basically, it was like an angel was on one shoulder, a devil was on the other shoulder, and it was the ego that negotiated between those two. The ego is kind of thought of in this context as that society. So you have these two internalized ideals or drives, if you will, and it's the ego, that's society, that says, nope, you can't act like that here, or nope, you can't do that, or yes, this is acceptable. And then he also observed that as we go through different stages of life, we have different psychological needs to be met. So Freud is in part of a sociology textbook because of the ego and because of the notion that as we move through life, we are in different groups and therefore have different experiences. Erikson, this is actually a picture, pretty sure this is no, it's not, this is not Erikson. Erikson argued that there were 8 different stages. He's probably one of my favorite psychological theorists or developmental theorists. And at each one of these stages, and of course they all involve people interacting with other people. At each one of these different stages, we would learn something about the world and about our place in the world, and how the result of that stage or the result of that lesson would then influence and predict the next stage. So in that sense, it is sort of like the experiences I have as an infant will influence the way I look at the world as a toddler, will influence the way I look at the world as a preschooler, and ultimately an adult. Probably the idea of Erikson that might be the most familiar is his notion of attachment and trust. And he theorized that it's infancy. In infancy, we learn to trust and we learn attachment. When we cry and our parents come and pick us up, or our parents don't come and pick us up, or maybe our parents come and they cause us pain, they hurt us, that we are learning about the world. When our parents pick us up and we cry and they pick us up and they do this over and over and over again, we've internalized, or we ultimately internalize, our sense of safety in the world, and then this predicts how we act in the future. So in that sense, it is this relationship between the individual and the group. Piaget is probably the least sociological on the list, because his focus was really on the cognitive development, the way our brain, the way we thought about the world. But he also acknowledged that other people influence the way our brain thinks about the world and processes it. So he argued that you go through these different stages. Then we have 2 names on here that are sociological. I wish I could remember whose picture this is. That are 2 sociological theorists on here, and one of them is Cooley and Mead. And Cooley's theory, this is an important one, pretty sure there's a quiz question about this, but Cooley's model argued that the way I learn about my place in the world is by imagining the looking glass. The looking glass would be a mirror. So I imagine how you imagine me. So it's my perception of your perception of me, right? You act as a mirror and you reflect back to me my value, my worth, or how I am. When you are nice to me, I think about myself in a certain way. When you are not nice to me, I think about myself in a certain way. If you say complimentary things, I will think about myself in a certain way. Or if you say critical things. So in that sense, other people are your mirror and they reflect who you are. So my immediate sense of who I am is determined by somebody else. Varies the individual and group. And then Mead introduces this idea of the individual, or what he called the significant and the generalized other. And the idea here is that by watching other people in society, by watching people around me, by watching my social environment, I learn about how the world is. But I'm going to like practice being in the world first by imagining or mimicking my significant others. And in this case, your significant others are your parents, the people who are closest to you, your parents, maybe your children, maybe your siblings, right? You take on the role of the other. You play kitchen, or you play taking care of the baby. the After we have mastered what it's like, what we imagine the world to be like from from those significant others, then a child may take on the role. They may practice on the generalized other, and so the generalized other would be like strangers or the person down the street. This idea that children will mimic what they have experienced, this gets used a lot in like psychological development, in child care, even in like crime investigation. So briefly, I worked at a center where they investigated and they researched people who had been accused sexual crimes, right? Child advocacy center. And when the children would come into the center, one of the ways that they would try to figure out if they had been hurt or how victimized was they would give them an anatomically correct doll and then just watch how they played with it. And the idea was that, and the words that children use for the different body parts. And the idea was that the children would mimic what they had seen or what had happened to them. And that's all based on this idea here of Mead's generalized and significant other. Fast forward a little bit into the 19th and the 20th century, and now we're moving into a more specific kind of developmental of the self, and this is moral development. Moral development simply means how we learn about what our culture, right? Because what our culture says is right and wrong. So moral development is how do we internalize the moral code of our culture, what our culture says is right and wrong. I do know who this is. This is actually Gillian down here. Kohlberg argued, and you've heard about both of these in psychology classes too. Kohlberg argued that a child goes through these three different stages of development about how they learn about what's good in the world or what's right. And the most elementary stage is pre-conventional stage. Pre-conventional. This is when a child learns about the world by their senses. They touch everything, they put everything in their mouth, right? They have to be able to see it or touch it or taste it in order for them to make sense of the world. So this is quite small. Then you move to the next stage is conventional. And because, a very small child doesn't really understand if they've hurt somebody's feelings. Even the concept of somebody else or the self, that your brain has to develop to a certain stage. The conventional stage is when a child is able to comprehend, or the idea that somebody else, this is where in psychology we talk about theory of mind, but it's the notion that somebody else has feelings, that I should be concerned about somebody else's feelings, right? That I can affect them and they are different than me. That's conventional. And then post-conventional, this is when we get a little bit older and, you're moving into adolescence and you're able to think about abstract ideas. Post-conventional is when we get to this abstract level of understanding the world and we begin to really question the idea, well, is it always wrong to take something that doesn't belong to you? Is it always wrong not, why is it okay for adults to hit children, but it's not okay for children to hit adults? And this is the post-conventional stage. But again, it's the idea that you have to go through these different stages in life, and it's by interacting with other people. And then you have Gillian, I'm pretty sure Gillian, and she is famous for her work on gender socialization, and specifically, the reason we have her here, specifically how she observed that girls and boys have a different sort of moral development, that boys were more likely to be I won't say logical, but they were more likely to follow the rules, right? If you broke the rule, that was wrong. We were supposed to follow the rules. Girls, on the other hand, were more likely to try to reason out or use some maybe justification, or maybe they were more relative before they evaluated somebody's behavior. Now, Gillian's research was not replicated, was not by other researchers, and that's a really important thing to do in research to find it replicatable. But her contribution is still that she considered gender as an element, or as a variable, as a factor in how we think about the world and what is right and what is wrong. And we will have a whole chapter where we talk about gender socialization. So gender socialization is the notion that boys and girls think about the world differently. Gillian's contribution was specific to how boys and girls evaluate right and wrong differently. And I'm going to stop that right here.